Hello and welcome. I'm Geeta Mohan and you're watching World Today. Amid allegations of China's export of dual-use goods to bolster Russian defense, President Xi Jinping was on a 6-day tour to Europe. The Chinese president also cleared the country's stand on Russia-Ukraine war and the conflict in the Middle East, that is, West Asia. Take a look at this report.
Chinese President Xi Jinping denied allegations of his country's support to Russia in its war against Ukraine. Xi, who was on a 6-day tour to Europe, stated China's stance to the European leaders during a meeting.
Regarding the Ukraine crisis, China has stated its position many times. China is neither the creator of the crisis nor a party or a participant of the war. However, we didn't just watch the fire burning across the river, but have been playing an active role in achieving peace. The Chinese government's special representative for Eurasian affairs has launched the third round of shuttle mediation.
She also said that China and France should work together to avoid a new Cold War.
In today's world, which is undergoing global changes and turbulence unseen in a century, both sides should uphold independence and jointly fend off a new Cold War or bloc confrontation, adhere to mutual understanding, and jointly promote a harmonious and colorful world where all countries can coexist.
The US, meanwhile, has accused China of dual-use exports of machine tools and microelectronics to support Russia's defense industry, which Beijing has denied.
We respect the ancient ties between China and Russia, as well as the efforts that have been made over decades to stabilize this relationship. In view of this complex story, we welcome the commitments of the Chinese authorities to refrain from selling any arms or aid to Moscow and to strictly control the export of dual-use goods.
This is Xi Jinping's first visit to Europe in 5 years. The visit is also being seen as China's way to express its role in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Xi, along with his wife, had also attended a welcome banquet held by French President Emmanuel Macron and his wife at the Elysee Palace in Paris. Xi had attended a China-France-EU trilateral meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Paris.
And finally, we have a substantial EU-China economic relationship. Our daily trade volume is around 2.3 billion euros a day. But this relationship is also challenged, for example, through state-induced overcapacity, unequal market access, and overdependencies.
The 6-day tour of the Chinese president concluded with his visit to Serbia and Hungary. With Mahashweta Lala, Bureau Report, India Today.
And to delve a little more on this issue on Spotlight this week, I'm being joined by Mayor Nowens, who is a senior fellow at the IISS and a senior fellow for Chinese security and defense policy. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us here on India Today. Beginning with the visit itself, what do you make of the visit? How significant is it given that it comes after 5 years? And in those 5 years, we've seen a lot of trouble between Europe and China.
Well, I think he has a couple of messages. I think the number of countries that he's chosen, and in particular which countries he's chosen to visit, is quite significant. Clearly, with France, he's trying to make bids to show that China still has relations with some of the most powerful European countries and capitals within the European Union. France, of course, is pursuing some trade ties with China. Macron's visit to Beijing recently made some progress in that respect, but very little of it actually came out of the meeting that they had in Paris and in France. But nevertheless, for Beijing, this is really a signal to show that Beijing still has an in with some key European capitals. And then, of course, there was the visit to Serbia and Hungary, and I think that's a different message. In particular, I think it's a signal that China still has some level of relationship with European countries on issues like the Belt and Road Initiative, which otherwise haven't been very popular in recent years. And second of all, of course, that China is courting countries that are in some ways closer to Russia. And that in itself is a signal to Brussels. I think a key message that was interesting that President Xi told Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, was, we are looking to you to become a more powerful member of the European Union and more powerful country in Europe. That should tell us a lot.
Right. Okay, let's just then first speak about Russia. We do know that there has been a lot of engagement when it comes to how to stop the war. The economies within Europe have had a huge trouble. Resources are depleted. There isn't much that Europe is being able to do. In such a scenario, Xi Jinping being in Europe, engaging the European Commission as also leaders of Europe, how do you see the role that they think Xi Jinping could have in stopping the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think Europe remains committed to supporting Ukraine in its defense against Russia's invasion and its illegal war. Of course, there is an element here whereby Europe, and in particular countries like France, have played an important role, Germany as well, and the Netherlands, when they visit Beijing, to signal to China and to President Xi that they would, to stress upon him that they would like China to not support Russia in ways that help Russia continue its war of aggression against Ukraine. That is definitely an important message that they're signaling. To date, of course, China has remained cautious in how far it will go to support Russia's economy and indeed its defense industry. But nevertheless, Europe would like to see China do more.
Right. But Mayor, there has been trouble when it comes to the relationship of China and the European world. We've seen Italy exit from the Belt and Road Initiative. There are problems and niggling areas with various other European countries. Cybersecurity is a huge problem, particularly with the United Kingdom. How do you see the engagement that both are seeking? Is it going to be advantage China or advantage the European nations? How do you see this go from here?
Well, I think European countries are still trying to balance their relationships with China. It's true that I think they're becoming more outspoken about some of the challenges that China poses to their national security. For example, you mentioned the cyber attacks. Certainly in the UK, that's been a topic of conversation very recently with reported cyber attack by PRC-linked entities on the UK's Ministry of Defence. However, I would say that for Europe, China, of course, is still an important market to trade with. And here there is a tension between the business interests in Europe and the national security interests that governments are trying to grapple with. And there you see European countries trying to maintain some sort of a pragmatic approach to the relationship with Beijing moving forward. Now, how likely that is going to be successful in the next few years is going to be something to watch.
And finally, before I let you go, Mayor, cannot not talk about the United States of America. So let's zoom out a little and look at how keenly DC watches developments between China and any other part of the world, particularly President Xi Jinping's visits. And in that, this visit also being very, very keenly watched and monitored. What do you think the agenda or the purpose of this visit is? Is it to see a fractured, divided Europe where China can consolidate its position and weaken the Western bloc, whether it's the United States of America's foothold presence in Europe, or for that matter, even within Europe, which is quite divided as we see?
Of course, a key strategy for Beijing is to divide and seek fractures where those exist and to widen them if possible. Certainly to create some sort of wedge within the transatlantic alliance also plays into this. And China is quite adept at doing so in certain ways. I mean, yes, Europe has its own policies when it comes to China. They can differ and clash with those of the United States. They're not always aligned in the same ways. But China is very heavily pushing towards Europe this idea of Europe acting as a third pole and echoing back words and narratives like strategic autonomy and China supporting Europe's strategic autonomy. Those words mean slightly different things from Beijing's perspective and from Europe's perspective, but it is certainly, I think, symbolic and representative of how China would like to see Europe move away from the US's policies of export controls and restrictions when it comes to things like the high-tech sector. And that's a message that China is sending to Europe and to Washington, D.C.
As pressure mounts on the U.S. for its continued support to Israel, President Joe Biden, in an interview for the first time, vowed not to provide weapons to Israel if it makes a full-scale invasion of Rafah.
U.S. President Joe Biden publicly vowed for the first time on Wednesday to stop giving Israel weapons if its forces make a full-scale invasion of Rafah, a city packed with refugees fleeing the war elsewhere in Gaza. In an interview with CNN, Biden said, quote, "I made it clear that if they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons." He acknowledged in the interview that American bombs provided to Israel have killed civilians in the 7-month-old offensive in Gaza, which came in response to Hamas's attack on October the 7th. The comments are the president's strongest public language to date and underscore a growing rift between the U.S. and its closest Middle Eastern ally. The interview was aired hours after Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin confirmed to the Senate that the U.S. had at least temporarily paused a planned delivery of thousands of heavy bombs, and that Biden made the decision to hold on the weapons over concerns for Rafah. That marks the first such delay since the U.S. administration pledged ironclad support to Israel.
You have to protect the people, the civilians in the battle space. Otherwise, you create more terrorists going forward.
The United States is by far Israel's biggest supplier of weapons, with Congress last month approving $26 billion in extra funding for the country. Biden said the U.S. would continue to provide defensive weapons, including for Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile system. But referring to civilian casualties, he added, "It's just wrong. We're not going to supply the weapons and artillery shells." The president is under growing pressure at home over American support for Israel as he runs for re-election this year. There was no immediate comment from Israel on Biden's remarks, but Israeli authorities have insisted Rafah must be hit, saying thousands of Hamas fighters are there. Its forces have continued tank and aerial strikes on southern Gaza after moving in on Tuesday via the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, which cut off a vital aid route.
Testimonies of witnesses began in the hush money case. Stormy Daniels appeared in the court and shared the detailed sexual encounter with former President Donald Trump and the hush payment made before the 2016 presidential election.
Porn star Stormy Daniels testified against former President Donald Trump in the hush money case. She talked about her alleged sexual encounter and the payment that she got to keep quiet before the 2016 presidential election. Daniels told jurors that after the arrangement was made public in 2018, her life was in chaos. Following Daniels' testimony, Trump's legal team asked for a mistrial. They argued that the details provided by her against Trump inflamed the jury and were irrelevant to the case, but Justice Juan Merchan denied the request.
The evidence thus far establishes quite clearly that there was a scheme to falsify records at the Trump Organization and to conceal payments to Michael Cohen that were reimbursing him for payments he in turn made to Stormy Daniels to keep her quiet about her alleged affair with the former president right before the presidential election. So I think that much has been pretty clearly established. What is less clear at this point is whether or not Trump himself was personally involved in the falsification scheme, and that's critical for establishing the charges in this indictment. Michael Cohen's testimony will be critical in this regard.
Trump has meanwhile denied having sex with Stormy Daniels.
So this was a very big day, a very revealing day. As you see, their case is totally falling apart. They have nothing on books and records, and even something that should bear very little relationship to the case. It's just a disaster for the DA, for the Soros-backed DA. It's a disaster.
But Daniels said Trump made sexual advances after inviting her to his hotel suite. She claims to have blacked out during her encounter with Trump.
But the judge clearly was concerned about the extent of detail in her direct examination. For example, she mentioned that the former president didn't use a condom when they had intercourse. She talked about the encounter in ways that did not allege that it was a sexual assault, but came very close to describing it in those terms. Things that, again, were not necessary for the story in terms of the allegations and the charges in this case. That said, there is an argument that some of the detail was necessary for the jury to evaluate why Trump would have been so concerned about the story coming out when it did.
The case revolves around the payment of $130,000 to Daniels from Trump's then lawyer Michael Cohen during Trump's 2016 campaign. Prosecutors say it was part of a scheme to illegally influence the campaign by bearing negative stories about him. With Mahashweta Lala, Bureau Report, India Today.
That's all we have in this edition, but before we go, we leave you with these visuals of a FedEx Airlines cargo plane which landed at Istanbul airport without the front landing gear deployed and managed to stay on the runway. The Boeing 767 aircraft flying from Paris informed traffic control tower at Istanbul airport that its landing gear failed to open. Thank you for watching. Goodbye and take care.